a lot of the time people don't understand why I want to perform and also be an academic at the same time. And I think what matters to me is that none of us is one thing. And it's really interesting to speak, for instance, to sex workers who are tech CEOs, or doctors who are also pole dancers, or, even in different environments, like people that have expertise in science but want to be creative writers. And I think we are all able to be different things at once.
Life today is chaotic, unpredictable, and constantly shifting. But within the chaos lies opportunity, and we're here to seize it. This is Generation Uncharted. Dr. Carolina R., thank you so much for joining us on Generation Uncharted. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm pretty good, a bit knackered. I've trained for 3 hours today already, but I'm excited to be sitting down.
Right, well, let's jump into our first question. So, we live in an era where social media platforms are claiming to support free expression, yet creators, and especially women and marginalized individuals, face censorship for sharing content about their bodies, their sexuality. So, why do you think these contradictions exist?
I think we live in an interesting time, isn't it? Because recently, just after the US election, Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of Meta, essentially said that we were moving towards an era of less censorship and more freedom. But that turned out to be less censorship for the alt-right and the same censorship for anybody else. So I think what social media platforms do is they replicate offline inequalities. And even though there was a time when people believed that tech was neutral or even inherently good, turns out that actually the biases of the people that target the algorithms, that make them, and the people that write the policies show up in the way the technology works. And on top of that, I think platforms in general are very keen to look good to their advertisers. So when it comes to women's bodies, when it comes to marginalized identities, those things tend to not sell in their head. And so they just prefer to hide them, which has a whole set of consequences apart from, the lack of freedom of expression. It affects people from when they're trying to learn about key information, whether it's about sexual health or, organizing, politics and stuff like that. But it also affects their ability to earn a living, which is particularly concerning for people like sex workers, who are the most affected by censorship and who found increased safety online because they didn't have to depend on intermediaries anymore apart from the platform. And suddenly laws were approved that made their lives increasingly harder. And because platforms work with machine learning, then anything that looked like nudity or potential sex work started being censored. So that's why we have a trickle down effect onto women's bodies, onto queer people, and basically everything that isn't a cisgender straight white man.
So it's interesting. Bisexuality, which is obviously something that I do a lot of work around, is always captured by the algorithms. So there was a big thing a few years ago when it used to be Twitter rather than X, where anything that had the word bisexual in it was sort of hidden.
Mm.
And the reasoning was because the majority of content that had the word bisexual in it was porn. And they were trying to hide that. Whereas, if I was writing an article about being bisexual, it's like that would get censored too. It was like, I almost understood the logic of, you're trying to protect certain people from seeing porn, but that's not what my content is about. And actually really weird, I've even worried about, hashtagging things on Instagram bisexual, because I'm like, will this just be flagged and no one will actually see it? So it puts you in a weird conundrum. So you were talking a little bit there about Mark Zuckerberg and obviously the change that's just sort of happened with Trump coming in. Have you seen a change in how the platforms have behaved in recent times, or is it still staying sort of consistent with regard to expression and sex workers and so forth?
So that's an interesting one because so I'm bisexual too, and I think actually what might have happened to you, I think it's more the algorithm recognizing sexual rather than bi and just being like, oh, we can't have that. But I don't know, it could be, that's probably how I would explain it. But in terms of changes that have happened recently, I think what I'm seeing as someone that sometimes, due to my research, plays the informal role of unpaid intermediary between Meta and deleted users is that it's now getting increasingly harder to reach Meta. Moderation is getting more and more inconsistent. The algorithm is out of whack. And it seems that there's less and less human workers and everything else is kind of given to AI, which sounds great in terms of productivity, but for topics that require nuance or cultural awareness, that just doesn't work. And I think, I'm seeing a lot of sex workers in my network having their accounts removed with no ability to recover it. And it's really concerning because then, we're seeing the likes of, harmful views by JK Rowling or whatever, like that's not a problem, on platforms. That doesn't seem to be a problem, at least. That just goes more and more viral, while people that are just trying to make ends meet or like express themselves are bearing the brunt of these changes. I think when the changes were announced, some people in the sex positive and queer communities were like, oh, maybe that means that we're going to be censored less. But I wasn't very optimistic about it, because I was just like, it's not our freedom that matters to these people. If anything, we're going to face more abuse because the people that would have abused us before now are allowed to do that openly. But it doesn't mean that our content is going to be visible, because the same people that are against queer and trans people are the anti-porn crusaders. And don't get me wrong, I'm not here advocating for, I don't know, 5-year-olds to watch porn. But I think it's always quite interesting to see how these of censorship start with porn and then expand onto everyone else. And I think, if we're looking at consistent running of these spaces, we have to be aware that they can't be the same thing for everyone. I think it's absolutely ridiculous to have spaces that work for a 13-year-old and work and work for an adult at the same time. That doesn't work. And I don't think that banning children or kids from social media is effective either. It's just that we need more investment into human workforces, and that's not where platforms want to go.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about AI doesn't get the nuance, and trying to think of a way to make all this work. I don't know. Is there a sort of Instagram, for example, version that you can have until 13, and then other content then comes until 60, and then go, is there sort of ways they can sort of tier it? So you've got YouTube Kids. I've got kids, so you've got YouTube Kids. So that's like, they're not going to click on anything that parents might not want them watching. And then obviously when they're older, they can go onto proper YouTube. So I don't know. It feels like something that they should be looking at in a bit more detail, which I guess brings us on to you, because you have a lot of strings to your bow. So you do a lot of pole dancing, but you also are an academic and a doctor, and you've been challenging a lot of this censorship. So I guess my question to you is, what strategies have you found effective in sort of pushing back against these kind of double standards?
It's a tricky one, because I feel like I'm very understood in my community. And sometimes I'm like, oh, this is so nice. Like, this feels great. Like, I am able to be who I am, and I don't have to tone myself down or edit my online presence because of what people may think of me. And then sometimes I get an interview, I get interviewed by a more mainstream account than mine. And then all of a sudden, you get a lot of haters that are like, oh, what is she doing? Won't somebody think of the children and all of that stuff? So I think, what I try to do is to live a life that I want to live within the limits of what's possible, because I used to be in an abusive relationship before I started pole dancing. I used to work in PR, which was really bad for my mental health, and I got burnt out. And I think because of all of those experiences, I kind of made a promise to my younger self to just like not be in situations where you just don't want to be anymore. Like, you don't want to be here anymore. I was just like, I just want to live a life that I like and that I want to live. A way for me to do that is to explore all the sides of me that are curious of living a certain lifestyle. And that hasn't always been easy because, it took me quite a while to find a postdoc after I finished my PhD. And I don't know if it's because the market in academia is not great or because my ass was out on the internet. It could be both. And I think that now that I am applying for permanent positions, the same issue might be arising. So I think I'm just trying to not compromise and always to justify what I do in a way, because I think, some people may be like, well, why does she need to post her almost naked body on social media? And my response is, well, why not? I am working hard in performing something that is very difficult. It's an art and a sport. A lot of the time, people don't understand why I want to perform and also be an academic at the same time. And I think what matters to me is that we are all not like none of us is one thing. I'm actually writing a paper right now on people that hold different identities, and it's really interesting to speak, for instance, to sex workers who are tech CEOs, or doctors who are also pole dancers, or even in different environments, like people that have expertise in science but want to be creative writers. And I think we are all able to be different things at once. And I think there's something deeply problematic in thinking that if someone shows their body or performs sexuality in one way or another, then they are not professional, because we all hopefully have a sex life. And I'm not saying that we all have to put it on show, but I think, as a survivor of sexual and domestic violence, it's very important for me to own and perform my sensuality and my sexuality. And I think pole dancing is a really interesting way of doing that, because it's an art and a sport that comes from the strip club. I think there are a lot of stereotypes about sex workers and strippers. And actually, strippers are some of the smartest, strongest people I know. And a lot of the activism that I do, I've learned from them. Performing an art and a sport that they have popularized and knowing how incredible they are as well really inspires me to say, hey, actually, doing something that is sensual and sexual doesn't mean you're less of a person, you're less smart, you're less hardworking. And I think it would do society a whole lot of good to be able to get rid of that stereotype, because then when does it stop? If you wear a miniskirt, are you not dressed professionally? And are you therefore not able to do your job? If you have a sex life, does it mean that then you have no right to hold a position of power? And I think when we identify sexuality with shame, then that shame can be exploited if an image of you gets leaked, or if you have a past working in the sex industry. And I think if we are able to dismantle those stereotypes, not just for sex workers but for everyone, I think we could all lead a better life.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you say there about sexuality, because I do think it's so weird. Like, a lot of people are brought up, whether from school or society or their parents, to think of sexuality as something shameful or dirty or something that we shouldn't talk about. And it does give you a concept in your mind. I think even I, growing up, had that concept of like, sex is naughty or it's dangerous or being sexual. And it takes some reworking of the brain to kind of get past, like, you're not doing anything wrong. Like, no one would exist if it wasn't for sex. Why do we feel this way? It's so odd. And then when you, as you were talking about with having multiple sides to yourself, because if you go on my Instagram, I mean, you can see me wearing like next to nothing on a beach or at a photo shoot. And then, you've got professional Lewis that, I'm sure some clients might go on my Instagram and be like, oh my goodness, who knows? So it's a weird situation these days where people have always had multiple versions of themselves. Most people are not the same version they are with their friends, with their mother-in-law. You know what I mean? Just to give one example. But actually, we have social media now, and you would sort of think that would have sort of made it all okay to have multiple sides to yourself. That of course you have a sexual side, of course you have an academic side, of course you have a professional side. Are you surprised that we're still having this debate, that we haven't kind of got to a point where we're like, yeah, people are sexual and they can also have other jobs.
I would like to say that I am surprised, but I think, the direction that the world has been taken doesn't really bode well for a more progressive society, because I think we were getting there initially. I think, the simple fact that I am able to live this life means that somewhere down the line, when I was building the social media profile, it was okay to do that. But I think as soon as economic interests have made it into platforms, which were pitched to us as a tool for freedom of expression. Like, I've just finished reading the memoir from the woman who used to be Meta's head of global policy, Careless People by Sarah Wynne Williams. And it's interesting how when the Arab Spring happened, these platforms were like, oh my God, this is great. Like, look what we enabled. Like, we are giving these people a tool to free themselves. And I think for quite a while, that was also true for the sex positive community. But then I think the power and the money became too good a goal for these companies to actually build any ethics into it. And I think, as soon as, Brexit happened, the first Trump election happened, you could see how you could exploit people's most reactionary views towards a certain aim. And then, at the same time, how much these companies rely on advertising from companies that most likely have similarly reactionary views. So I think that's why we are where we are, and we were probably on an upward trajectory, and now we're going back down, which I think brings me back to what you were saying, like, can we have platforms for kids, or how do we solve this issue of the lack of nuance in technology? Platforms don't like this solution when I give it to them, but more often than not, we need governments to stop cozying up to these companies and recognize that they have a public value and treat them like any other public service. But at the moment, these companies are performing a form of public service while keeping all the privileges and lack of accountability of a private company. So I think the system is currently broken, and it's up to international regulation and human rights law to improve it, I think.
Yeah, it's such an odd one. It's one of those things where I'd say I don't have the solution to this, because I think people are always going to be unhappy. This side will be unhappy or that side will be unhappy, because they're different companies as well, so they'll take different avenues. So I don't know if it's one of those things where there'll always be an element of they could do better from everyone. It's a bit of an odd one. But I wanted to talk to you about pole dancing as well. So give me your pole dancing origin story. How did you get involved in pole dancing?
So my origin story is that I was living in Australia by myself because I moved there for a master's in criminology. I decided to retrain after working in PR, and after leaving my abusive partner here in the UK. I kind of applied for one master, and I was like, well, if I make it, I make it, and it will be destiny that I have to move. So I moved to Australia with this very naive idea of what I was going to do. I thought I was going to set up a panini truck on Bondi Beach while I retrained. And turns out it's not that easy to just, open a business from scratch while you're also just like very lonely, very homesick, and you're basically retraining. So an acquaintance from my university was like, hey, a friend of mine has a showcase at this pole dance school, which is really close to the university. Do you want to come see it? So I went to see it, and I was blown away. It was so cool. I've always been a massive show off, but I just had no talent. Like, I wanted to be a rock star growing up, but I couldn't really sing apart from like karaoke or like under the shower. And so watching that, I was like, wow, like, it's the music that I like in a really cool environment. Everybody seems really friendly. I have no friends because I moved to the other side of the world. So maybe I can do this. I also used to do artistic gymnastics as a child, and I gave up when I was like 10 for no real reason other than I was lazy. So I gave up, and I missed that. I missed being upside down. I missed the danger of like handstands and whatever. So that seemed like a match made in heaven. So I started, and I became obsessed with it. The good thing about Australian schools as well, which doesn't always happen in the UK, is that they would have showcases every 3 months. So from very early on in your pole journey, you can perform and see if you like it. And I really liked it. So I think my first solo competition back in the UK was only a year after I started, and I won it as an amateur, which was wild to me. And I really, really enjoyed that. And at the same time, I'd come back to the UK, I started my PhD, and that was when my supervisors were like, initially, you don't know what you're going to do with your career. Maybe it's better to create a separate pole persona on your social media than your academic persona, which is why I then started the blog and accounts Blogger on Pole, which is my current handle, that I ended up unifying after I finished my PhD anyway, because I was already a blogger. I already, wrote lifestyle and travel articles, but then pole became my whole life, and I decided that I wanted to write about everything through the lens of pole dancing. And it turns out that it didn't really make sense to separate the two. Like it did at the time, but then because my research, which was already on social media regulation and social media content governance, was so embedded with the censorship that pole dancers and sex workers and everyone else in our community was facing, that joining the two made more sense. So I was almost forced to be both people at the same time, because the admin of trying to keep the two separate was just too much.
Tell me about the evolution of pole dancing then, because I think if you think of like the 90s and films, pole dancing is very sexual, but the world has really moved on with its sort of perception of things. And I would imagine some of the men and women that would have gone to see pole dancing shows in the 90s now would just watch porn if that was what they were looking for, something overtly sexual. So I would imagine the clientele of people that would go to see a pole dancing performance has maybe changed a little bit. And in my mind now, I don't know why, I just see pole dancing is sort of more of a sport than something that's sort of entangled with sort of porn and sex work too much, which obviously is the origins. So talk to me a little bit, because I don't know, so you educate me. Just talk to me a little bit about what the culture of pole dancing and how has that evolved over time.
So I actually don't agree. I think there are a lot of styles of pole. And I think actually, yes, pole dance has become a sport, but it's also very much an art form. And I think it kind of depends on how you see it and what you're looking for when you're looking for a performance. I think, first of all, I also don't know if like people that were going to strip clubs before would now just watch porn instead, because I think what you get from a strip club performance, for instance, is completely different from what you get from a pole performance, because strippers have a magic and a skill that transcends the mere pole trick. Like, I think, again, because there are so many styles of pole and there are so many styles of stripping, you will find strippers that maybe don't do many tricks on the pole, but are incredibly sensual in their clothing removal and in their audience engagement. And that's an art form in itself. But for instance, in the US, in the Deep South, if you think of the series P Valley, for instance, you see these strippers doing incredibly difficult tricks on floor to ceiling poles that are like several meters high, while also being incredibly sexy, which to me is just like magic. It's crazy. But
As someone that has drunkenly tried to pole dance in a club, I can tell you it is a lot harder than it looks. My God, being able to hold your body weight and those positions is like, that is not something anyone can just do off the bat.
exactly, while also choreographing the removal. Because I think like a lot of people think that, oh, taking clothes off is really easy. Well, it's not, because you could, like if you just kind of take something off, like, yes, okay, maybe for, the drunk guy in the back, that's really, really interesting. But after a while, it's the mastery of taking it off in a specific way that teases the audience, that is quite interesting. But at the same time, I think, there has been an evolution towards the sporty side of pole. I think particularly, in Eastern Europe, pole has become embedded with the skill of ballet and gymnastics. So that is a style in itself. But I wouldn't say like, I think, to be honest, even though I do think pole is a sport, but it's a sport that is also sensual and can be sexual. Because I think if you wanted to do any sport, you could have done gymnastics or ballet. But I think the choice of pole is quite interesting to me because its history really shapes its moves. There are moves called the hello boys or the vagina monster, and they're all like spreadies. Do you know what I mean? Like, again, you could be doing anything else, but you are doing pole. So I think the element of sensuality and sexuality and its origins are ever present. And I think that's what makes pole so special because, again, I think it's something that has to be performed for a crowd. I remember during the pandemic, we were desperate to do anything. So we would organize pole dance showcases online. But as someone who loves performing for a crowd, it's just so anticlimactic to like come off the pole and like you don't hear the clap, like you don't hear people
Where's my
shouting.
applause?
It's like, and then you're still in your living room. It's really, really weird. And I think, every form of performance is valid, and I'm actually, I for instance, I don't watch porn because it doesn't do it for me, like, to watch porn by myself. But I love going to porn screenings in cinemas because the audience is really interesting, like the reaction to the crowd. And I think similarly pole performances are something, and strip club performances as well, there's something to be witnessed. So I don't know, like I don't know, like that probably doesn't answer your question because I've just
No,
taken
you
it
you know
off the
what?
whole.
You answered about 3 questions in once. You're making me work for it today. I wanted to ask though about that kind of vibe at a pole dance performance. What do you feel when you're there? Do you feel safe? Do you feel admired? And then sort of off the back of that, what would you say to a young person that either wants to try pole dancing but is terrified that people are going to grab them or something? Or what would you say to maybe a young man that wants to go and see it because he thinks it's sensual and he's interested, but he thinks people will think that he's pervy for going?
Well, I think unfortunately people are always going to think something, right? Like, we live in a world where people are not shy of sharing their thoughts, particularly if they are shaming others. So I think, when you engage with a sensual art form or something that is sexual, sadly there is always some stigma attached to it, but the stigma that an audience member will get will never be the same stigma as, for instance, a sex worker or a performer. And again, pole dancers may, be the victims of some judgment, but because of the way people are now seeing pole more and more as a sport, that's never the type of stigma that a sex worker will face, which is deeply
Mm.
problematic for sex workers because it's kind of like they gave us this art, but we are getting all the praise, and they're not getting any less stigma. Although luckily pole dancing is making sure that at least these conversations are happening. So again, when it comes to audience members or people that want to perform or people that want to do a class, it all depends on the environment. If you're going to a pole dance class, it's very unlikely that people will grab you. The only people that may touch you, and again, they should ask for consent with that, is the instructor. Because a really nice element of pole dancing is that you may be risking to break your neck because you're doing crazy moves, but there's always someone to hold you up and to spot you. So I think that's both a physical and an emotional experience of like knowing that someone has your back. The amount of crotches I've had in my face while spotting my students, and it's all like completely sanitized in that case, because like what I care at that moment is not the crotch in my face, is that my student doesn't die. And I think that also tells you quite a lot about society in general, because a lot of the time my students can be like, oh my god, I haven't shaved, I'm so sorry, or like, I'm on my period, and I'm like, I don't care, like I just need you to survive this move right now. And so your brain just goes elsewhere. Now, when it comes to a performance, again, it depends on when or and where you're performing. So if you are thinking of performing at a strip club, different strip clubs will have different rules. Technically, in a lot of clubs and in a lot of countries, clients are not allowed to touch strippers, and security is there to make sure that that doesn't happen, although that's not a guarantee. If you are performing at a show, be that a cabaret or a pole showcase, those events are organized with education of the audience in mind as well. So good etiquette is to not touch the performers without their consent. So if you go there, that's not for you to touch, it's just for you to watch. But what's really beautiful about those events is that people are very supportive. So you will see the audience clapping, you will hear the audience screaming. If you watch any of my videos, you will hear the girlies in particular in the background. One of my favorite performances that I've done was last year. It was Easter Sunday for my friend's studio showcase, and I was like, well, it's Easter, I have to do something religious. So I did Like a Prayer by Madonna, and I had this like halo crown that I then took off and licked. And it was apparent to me that there were a lot of mothers in the audience, because this was my friend's studio, and basically a lot of people were going to watch their family members or their friends, and there were a lot of moms in the audience. And you could tell that they were moms because they were going for it. They loved Madonna. Like there were people like stomping their feet, people getting up. Like it's just really, really, I don't know, it's just really satisfying to like just come off the stage and be like, I did that. So it's really nice. Not all audiences are the same. Some might be warmer than others, but usually pole dance show audiences are very warm.
Are there any celebrities that you have seen pole dancing or that have been in films that you're like, yes, they did it justice? Or any celebrities that incorporate pole dancing into their act?
Ooh, okay, that's a good one. Well, I mean, FKA Twigs has been known to do a lot of pole dancing, and she does it really well. She's really, really good. I would say her style is different from, for instance, what I would perform, because she's very ethereal. And I think a lot of strippers have been a bit mad of how, again, how much attention that got. And sometimes journalists would try to detach stripping from that, while in reality I believe from what I've seen that Twigs has been taught by a lot of strippers as well. But I think, you know, she's definitely created something beautiful just out of her own talent as well. I mean, there was the movie Hustlers, which was incredibly annoying to everyone in the pole and sex working scene, because the ads that we were getting for it on social media, like we couldn't open Instagram without ads for Hustlers while we were being shadow banned. So that was really annoying. Although I did really like J-Lo's, you know, pole acts in the movie. You know, Snoop Dogg did a tour hiring a lot of pole dancers to perform, and actually a lot of my friends have performed for it, and it was beautiful to watch because they were absolutely amazing. Other movies, well, one of my favorite movies is Closer. You don't see much pole dancing in it, but Natalie Portman has created that iconic look with the pink wig, and it's absolutely amazing. There were others from the 90s. I mean, Showgirls is a classic, and some of the performances there are absolutely stunning. But I would say probably in terms of like TV, the most out there, like badass that you can see is probably P-Valley right now. It's really, really good. And I believe that there's quite a few strippers consulting for it as well, which I think is quite important, because a lot of the time you will see these movies and they are completely unrealistic. So I really like when, you know, businesses employ strippers for their consulting and even for training their performers. Although I have a performance coming up, I am judging for the third year in a row. I'm judging the Sexual Freedom Awards, which I really recommend attending if you get the chance. It's a beautiful ceremony that uplifts and celebrates the pioneers in sexual freedom, including activists, sex workers, strippers. I won for Activist of the Year in 2019, and I've been judging for 3 years, and this year I'm guest performing as well. And I am bringing an act that is inspired by the first example of pole dancing that I've ever seen as a teenager, which looking back looks a bit like a safety hazard having watched the video. But I'm just going to say that Kate Moss was involved, and it was burned into my brain because the song was really good. So I'm using that song.
Well, I'm down. Send me the link. I want
I
to come
will.
to this award
I
show.
will.
Perfect. So let's move on a little bit, because this podcast, and the reason I wanted to have you on, it is all about navigating the modern world, trying to stay authentic to yourself, trying to figure out what success looks like. And you, to me, from the outside, do that really well. You know, you're an academic, you're an activist, you're a performer. There's lots of versions of yourself that you are working on and putting energy into. And a lot that we've talked about is about judgment. And I think judgment is something that others do to us, but we also do to ourselves. So I wanted to know, What are the things that you judge yourself for? What are you most critical to yourself about?
I think it's my dancing. I'm very critical about my dancing because I feel like I've always been a massive nerd. I've always been very good at school. I'm from a very small town in northern Sardinia, and one of the Italian islands. And it was so small that when you get a really good mark when you graduate high school, that ends up in your local paper. So I've always been used to like being good at school, writing a lot. So I obviously judge myself if, let's say, I get an article rejected from an academic paper, or if I feel like I haven't expressed myself properly. But I think it's never emotional, because having done that type of work for quite a long time, I know how to improve it. While I think for my dancing, because it's something incredibly emotional for me, because I got into pole dancing at a really difficult time in my life, and it's something that I'm not trained at. I'm not, I have teaching qualifications now. Obviously, I'm a semi-retired instructor because I just don't have time to teach that much anymore. But obviously, I have those qualifications. But in terms of the raw talent of dancing and like being able to deliver a performance, that's something that I judge myself for very harshly, because the variables of performing are many. So for instance, you may be on your period, so you're more tired and sensitive to pain, or more emotional, and so you get more stressed, or the space could be very humid, so maybe you don't have enough grip on the pole, or maybe you have a wardrobe malfunction, because when you're upside down, anything can happen. So there are so many variables to think through, and at the same time, knowing that this is something I do for sheer pleasure, which is a privilege that I don't have to do. I don't have to do it for work all the time, but still, because of that, because it means so much to me, if, like, I don't know, a foot goes wrong or goes in the wrong direction or something, like, I take it really, really personally, and I judge myself very, very harshly. And I know that, like,
Right.
to an audience member, that may mean nothing. Like, they may not even notice it, but then I'm like, damn it, like, I've been trying this, I've been rehearsing this for ages, and like today had to go wrong.
Do you still enjoy it, or does sometimes that perfectionist take you out of it?
Perfectionism used to take me out of it, but I've tried to make steps to avoid that. So stopping to teach was one of those steps, because when I got my postdoc job, and I was teaching regularly every week, I was teaching group classes and private classes, I wasn't training for myself anymore. So I felt like I wasn't developing, and it was really sad to leave my students. But at the same time, as soon as I posted a video on Instagram, or performed somewhere, all I kept thinking was, oh, people are going to think she's not good enough as an instructor. And so removing the teaching was really important for me, because it gave me back the time to focus on my own training and improve, and also enjoy myself. And then another thing I decided to remove from my life was competitions, because while competitions are really fun, because it's like the whole pole community kind of in one place, at the same time, it's such a long day. Like, it's usually like 12 hours of competing if you're lucky, or rather, you compete for 5 minutes maybe, but then because there's everyone in your categories, or there's other categories, before you find out the results, it's like the evening or the late evening, and you're like there with the stress for the whole day. And it's also not super enjoyable for people outside pole to watch, because by the time you've watched 25 pole dancers, you're like, oh my god, everything is blending into one another. So I was tired of trying to fit into a marking scheme that gave me points for whether I did a trick the right way or not. And I realized that what I liked the most was being on stage. So now I'm focusing more on like paid performances, or even, charity performances, like the case of the Sexual Freedom Awards, just because I like the sheer joy of performing. And competitions set you back with quite a lot of money, because you have to pay to enter, then you have to pay for costumes, you have to pay to travel there, you have to pay for the accommodation. And if you don't win anything, it's kind of like, well, I just put myself through a whole lot of stress for nothing. So I think, I'm still a perfectionist. I still want to perform well, but removing myself from teaching and competitions is making sure that this thing, which for me started as a hobby, is still a hobby. Because I remember I was in therapy and I was like, I'm so tired, I'm so overwhelmed because I'm doing academia and I'm doing social media work and I'm doing teaching and performing. And my therapist was like, so when do you have fun? And I was like, huh? So I realized that I turned all my hobbies into work. And I think, the girl boss tendency of the 2000s is luckily very much gone. I'm tired of being a girl boss. I'm a girl struggle. And I just want to girl survive.
No, I get that. I'm someone that's definitely been in that position of you've turned all of your hobbies into work, so what are you doing for fun? I wanted to ask you just briefly though, if someone were to turn to you and say, Dr. Carolina, what does success and enjoyment and living well look like for you? And I want to make sure that I don't get to, my 50s and look back and think I wish I'd have done that. What have you learned about living on your own terms, enjoying your life and feeling successful?
I've learned that it takes a certain amount of privilege, because I think a lot of people think that, oh, she's just like living her best life. That's so great. And that's easy. It's not. So I work in a job, academia, that allows for a certain amount of freedom and self-expression. If you work with children or if you work for institutions that are more conservative than, say, a university, which is already quite conservative, you may not have that same amount of privilege. So navigating these spaces means navigating rules that you may not necessarily be privy to. So I think that's something to bear in mind. But I think, ultimately for me, what success looks like is being able to be true to myself in a less precarious way. Because I think what people don't realize is that actually a lot of this is going from contract to contract, temporary contract to temporary contract. And I can do it because I'm a homeowner, not out of my own merit, but because my parents bought me a house. Because in Italy, we don't have that freehold and leasehold business. If your family builds a house, it stays in the family. So obviously that is dream, right? That is wealth that you like, that people in my social class in Italy wouldn't have in the UK. So that has been massively helpful. And even if, I do need to pay the bills, knowing that I still have a roof over my head really allowed me to pursue these things. And I think it's very important for people to consider what privileges I have available to me and what sacrifices am I prepared to make. And sometimes, you may prefer living well and not having a precarious life. And that's very valid. I would love that. That's what success looks like to me. And that's my next step that I'm hoping to reach.
I could do, a 10-hour podcast about housing, because I really do think that it comes down to everything, and so many people are spending more than half their monthly wage on where they live, which is just awful, because then they don't have the money or the time to pursue other things. But on home, because I do think so many people now struggle with where to live, having a sense of community where they live, obviously the cost, but you are someone that has lived in a lot of different places around the world. So what is home to you, and how do you make somewhere a home?
Ooh, that is an excellent question. Well, I am a dual citizen now as of last year. So I would say that my home is London, Hackney, and Sardinia, Italy. And so I do this by trying to embrace the life that I lead in those places. So in Italy, I'm a lot calmer, not in terms of my speaking. I speak a lot louder in Italy, but I think, the pace is just slower, and I try to embrace that. And I try to do the things that I love doing there, which is going to the beach, seeing family. While here in London, it's more of a hustle and it's more going to events and embracing that. And I think I survive because of that duality. But a thing that has made a home in both places is my pole. I have a pole in both houses, and that's necessary for me to feel well and to be able to train every day. And actually, the community is quite crucial to that, because that's something, knowing that somewhere has a pole studio is a very easy way for me to make friends and make connections, and just to feel safe. Other than that, my books and food.
That was a really good answer. And it's
Mhm.
actually quite interesting how much of that was be guided by the people around you, which is quite nice. So we're on to our final question now, which really, we just like to end on a positive note on this podcast. So we ask our guests to either tell us one funny story or one heartwarming recent moment.
Well, a heartwarming thing for me is that actually an aspect that we don't cover a lot in interviews about me is that I've really struggled with dating towards my life, not just because of my experiences of being in an abusive relationship, but also because in general, I think even though a lot of people appreciate and admire what I do, no matter the field, like even in academia, I do not get seen as a person, but more as a character or like someone that is there for entertainment, which is really strange to me because my life is actually quite boring. Like a lot of my evenings are spent rewatching Buffy the Vampire Slayer over and over again. It's my favorite series.
That's good. It's not as good as Charmed, but it's good.
Ooh, spicy opinion. Okay. I also did love Charm, but I believe that Buffy has a better ending. But anyway, we can't fight for that because that takes a whole other podcast. But something that's been really, really nice and heartwarming for me in the past year is actually I've been in a relationship with my best friend of 12 years, and that was very surprising. But I feel like he's probably the only person that has managed to see me fully because he's seen me struggle. Like he's seen me through the beginning of my pole journey to the point where some of his friends were like, Carolina is really bad at it, isn't she? And then like suddenly they were like, oh wow, she's good now. Okay. So like he's seen me through all the phases of my life, and he's still able to, support me and just be there, not just as a partner and as a friend. And that's been really wholesome and has made me really happy so far. So yeah.
That is beautiful. So you are in a relationship now. I thought
Yes.
you were telling me a story of I can't find a boyfriend or a girlfriend.
Oh, no. I am with, yeah, I am. Sorry, that was confusing. But yeah, I've been in a relationship with him for the past 8 months. It's been really nice.
So I have to ask an additional question now because you've got me interested. So how would you like to be approached if someone saw you and thought she is amazing, she's an academic, she does the pole dancing, how would you want to be approached these days?
It's an interesting one because sometimes I've had some really, really weird approach attempts. And like, don't get me wrong, like people are polite a lot of the time. But there has been like this one case that really weirded me out where I performed at a sex party a while back, and someone DM'd me being like, hey, my partner and I found you really attractive. Do you like, do you want to go to the party and have sex together? And I was like, ask a girl out for a drink first or something. So I think just like, the attempt to get to know me, like I've actually made some really nice friends through social media and through events. um, People that saw me as a performer first and got to know me after. But the people that did it well would always treat me as a person, so try to find out more about me, approach me as if I was any other person that they were meeting. And I think putting me on a pedestal has never worked for me because I've always felt like a performing monkey, like I don't know, someone that you'd expect to drop into a split at any minute, which I
I
can do
love
when I
that.
do, but
Yeah,
just don't take it for granted.
I love that. Dr. Carolina R, this has been a brilliant interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, really looking forward to listening again. I hope I don't get cancelled.
And just quickly, if someone is interested in pole dancing and the work that you do, where can they find you?
So if I'm not shadow banned, you can search for Blogger on Pole all over social media, or bloggeronpole.com for my blog. If I am shadow banned, it just means that you have to type my whole username in full, which is really annoying. But yes, that's it.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.